Welcome back to the panel discussion, Innovation in Government, Cyber Leaders on Identity Management, sponsored by Carahsoft on Federal News Network. My guests are Bill Baz, DoD Account Executive at Radiant Logic, Frank Briguglio, Public Sector Identity Governance Strategist at SailPoint, Habib Horani, Solutions Engineer at Okta, and Kevin German, Regional Manager of Federal Customer Success at CyberArk. Let's start with you, Frank. As the perimeter continues to shift from traditional firewall-based boundaries, talk to us about the challenges that you're dealing with in that regard.
Sure. The network perimeter is not as we once knew it, and the identities become that new perimeter. So as we see this shift and we see the paradigm shift of security, we need to manage the identity and manage the entitlements. It's not just about the authentication. We talk about the CAC, the PIV, the derived credential. That lets you in the door. But what can you do once you get inside the house? And that's what we really need to focus on and get better at doing.
So are there any particular aspects that need more attention than others?
Sure. I think where we see a lot of focus now is actually focusing on how we're granting access, ensuring that suitability, and automating that process. Most federal agencies are still doing a lot of things with manual access request processes that are disconnected, and that inherently leads to problems when someone leaves an organization. How do we know all the access they had if we manually provisioned them and we don't have that full automation or log snapshot of that process? So I think that's where a lot of agencies are headed, and that is a good thing. Injecting that suitability check on a continuous basis. We're checking devices to make sure devices are compliant, but what about the user? That's not something that should be done once. It's something that should be done continuously.
Mm-hmm. Kevin, I want to ask you very quickly to chime in on that. How do you know when somebody's out the door and you don't really see what's happening with eyes on?
Absolutely. So I think, as Frank mentioned, right, identity being that layer that helps provide abstraction in terms of what people are doing, what type of access they have, what they can do with their access. From my perspective, I think it's really important to understand that when we look at insiders, right, they are already in the network. So those boundaries that we're building on the outside, they're gone, right? They're already past that boundary point. And if they're using a PIV or CAC to access the system, again, that's into the door. But once they're on that system, how are you making sure that they're doing what they should be doing, right? Maybe that's permissions-based access. Maybe it's an analytics system that can go back and respond to threats, right? If someone uses for example, someone uses a credential or some other type of privileged access to log onto a system, and they're doing that outside of an approved workflow. What type of alerts do we have around that? What type of automatic response, right? When we talk about automation, we said that word many, many times today. It's extremely important, right? We don't have a team of people just sitting there waiting to respond to incidents. They're already overloaded with the logs and things that they're reviewing. We need a way to automate that response and trigger a response.
Bill, I want to ask you specifically about identity integration, and we're hearing about the need, and this is very obvious and clear, that the need to verify where people are and where they exist in your network and what they're doing in your network. Those are key pillars, obviously, of building or modernizing a platform or whatever it is that you're working on with reference to your work. But I'm just interested in how identity migration, or rather identity integration, is that important first step. How does that plug into being the first step? How does it become the first step? Why is it the first step in modernization?
Well, thank you, JJ. If you look at identity holistically, right, there's a wide array of different variables that you have to kind of look at and analyze. And this was part of this previous segment, was talking about how identity is a constant moving target. It's not really, a one size fit all, I guess you could say. What we've realized working with the public sector, and namely in the commercial industry as well, is initiatives change, requirements change. However, applications still need data, and they need it in specific structures, they need it in specific schemas, and they need it based off the specific need of the mission. Who is John Doe what are his attributes, where is he located, and what should he have access to. Has he left the organization? Should he be onboarded? Should he be offboarded? Should he have that segregation of duties? And then should there be privileged access for that specific entity as well? So when you look at identity from a stack perspective, the common denominator across the board is in order for all these various different technologies and applications and really mission requirements to be successful, they all need the data. And with reference to OMB M1917, they talk about the need to really harness and leverage the authoritative sources as the sole source of truth. So from a Radiant Logic perspective, it's really about removing integration from a bottleneck to a mission enabler and providing that federated attribute exchange service to really enable the likes of all your existing and future mission requirements, all while maintaining your existing investments.
So what's your biggest challenge in doing that?
The short answer is it always depends, right? You could say in certain cases policy, or you could say executive buy-in. What we've seen recently is with the whole notion of digital transformation or IT modernization, a lot of organizations, as they migrate to the cloud or they go to AWS or Azure, identity is becoming more and more of a bottleneck. And so now identity is kind of back into the forefront in terms of how it not only enables the mission, but also helps lower costs as well as accelerates the time to the mission. So the long answer is that. The short answer is a multitude of different factors. This entire panel is not only a great set of parties, but we work together. There may be a little bit of overlap in certain areas. However, collectively as a suite, I guess if you are a Marvel fan, I would classify it as the Avengers of Identity.
Okay.
Right?
You heard that, folks.
A couple chuckles in the crowd.
So he's laid it down, and that's a pretty high bar, Bill.
Well, we've said it, and we intend to maintain it.
All right. Well, okay. So we're going to go over to you now, Habib, because you've been committed to this team.
I'd love to know which team member I am.
Yeah, well, that would be an interesting show in itself. What cape are you wearing? But so what's Okta's take on identity's role in Zero Trust?
Love the question. I think it's really important. And I think it's identity, like somebody mentioned, it's become the new perimeter, right? It's no longer at the firewall. It's no longer in the building, right? Everybody's got mobile devices. Everybody's moving to the cloud. So those traditional boundaries are broken down. So we start to look, when you look at Zero Trust, we look at identity as the core of that, because now you have to look at the individual. And you have to look at the individual in more than one way. You have to look at the attributes of that individual, right? You have to look at the entitlements. What do they have privileged access to? But also, when they're signing in or they're trying to authenticate in, right? What is the context around that? Scoring that transaction to look for anomalous behavior, right? What are policies that we want to build that don't allow that? Because fundamentally what Zero Trust comes down to is, you can say it's trust but verify, but at the end of the day, it's I'm not going to let you do anything till you prove to me, hey, you're saying you're JJ, prove to me that you're JJ. And I'm going to apply policy to make sure that you are JJ, right? So again, right context, right level of access to the right application under the right conditions, and continuously monitoring that to make sure that just because you said you were JJ now, in 20 minutes, are you still JJ, or is it somebody else trying to impersonate JJ?
That's an interesting concept there. So, and I'm going to move over to Frank on this part. And if you want to chime in again, Habib, please. But efficiently and effectively managing that verification process. I mean, there could be 50 JJs, but figuring out which one is the right one at the right time, in the right place, doing the right thing can be daunting. So how do you enforce that through your process?
Sure. In the process of managing the identity, and we've touched on this a little bit, and it's something I repeat a lot, is having the most data about the identity, right? To model your access, to model how you're granting that access. You can't do any of that without understanding attributes and metadata about the users and the applications and the environment. So the more data we gather together, we can build modeled access in policies that can run at runtime through access control that ensure the right people are getting the right access.
Very interesting. Habib.
Yeah, and I think, so building off that, I think that's where that Avengers model comes in when you have a suite like this, right?
Yeah.
Because there's different layers to this cake, right? And we're all going to address a different layer throughout the identity lifecycle. Because when you look at Zero Trust, right, Zero Trust is a path. It's not a switch, it's not a checkbox, it's not like, hey, I enforced this policy, I'm good to go, I have Zero Trust now. So being able to have agencies look at every piece of context, every attribute, everything they can to make those informed decisions, and then take that a step further and automate it, right? Because provisioning is great on the onboarding. You could almost argue that deprovisioning is even more important. Because if a user leaves, well, we want to make sure that that is getting updated in the authoritative source, right? There are known entitlements. We need to react on that we are shutting off their access, and that they don't have access to anything even more privileged that they should.
So
right?
the question of assurance, making sure you're doing the right thing.
Right.
And then over to you, Kevin, for your thoughts on that. But how does assurance factor into that?
That's key. I think with how highly regulated the federal space is, right? They have to have a process that is almost bulletproof. It needs to work when it needs to work. You don't have, especially when you start to talk about the DoD space, right? Absolutely. You can't have a warfighter that still has access to a secure network that they shouldn't, right? Same with DOJ, right? They need it to work. It needs to be repeatable, consistent, and auditable, right? Because they need to prove that it works.
Kevin.
Yeah, first of all, what the panel's already shared has been great. I'm going to kind of sound like a broken record here, but
Does that include the Avengers model?
yeah, I do like that as well. Yes, absolutely. Okay. As has been pointed out, Zero Trust is not one tool. It's not one solution, right? It's a strategy, and I think looking at it from insiders that have privileged access, but we're also talking about third-party vendors that are out there, right? We talk about people that are outside of our environment, right? And that's been brought up today. People that need access to something, but how do we contextualize who they are, what they should have access to, and then remove it when they're done, right? How do we give them, the concept, it's kind of a buzzword, but the just-in-time administration, right? To be able to authenticate through a system, have an identity, and have that revoked after a short period of time is critical, right? And that's something that, there is no one silver bullet for that, right? And I think that's where all these different solutions kind of come into play.
Insider threat is a huge issue for everyone, and I've noticed that in some of your writings and discussions, you've highlighted it. It's very, very, very high up on your list.
Absolutely.
Is that the most important thing that you're dealing with? Looking forward, looking out.
I think it depends on the space, right? I think in the Department of Defense specifically, I think insider threat is the biggest threat, right? On the federal civilian side, I think you have a multitude of threats, including insider threat. What I'll say is that, what CyberArk focuses on is the keys to the kingdom, right? So we are operating under the mentality of assuming breach, assuming that a bad actor, whether they be a nation state or an insider, are in that environment, right? So from our perspective, if it's an insider or an external threat, we really don't care. We want to lock those keys to the kingdom, right? So if someone tries to use those to attack or move laterally and carry out the attack chain, CyberArk wants to stop that from beginning, right? Put proactive controls around that and protect the interior.
Okay. Back to you, Bill. ICAM. From your perspective and from the work that you're tasked with doing, 2020 is coming, and we know that the DoD National Defense Strategy is very important as any day, from now until 2033 or beyond. Talk to us a little bit about how ICAM plugs into all of what you're planning and working on with your folks.
And JJ, that's a great question. And a part of that is also the DoD Digital Modernization Strategy that came out the FY19 and 2023. And ICAM is its own line of effort and part of that document. But if we unpack the National Defense Strategy, it really boils down to 3 key lines of effort. And that's building a more lethal force, strengthening alliances and attracting new mission partners, as well as reforming the DoD for greater performance and affordability. Identity is a critical component in all those lines of effort. If we unpack the first one, building a more lethal force, the ability to integrate, ingest, aggregate, normalize data across all these various different domains and repositories to then be interoperable across the emerging mission requirements. If we're talking about stranded alliances and attracting new mission partners in the commercial world, we refer to as M&A. Organization by merges with one, vice versa. In the federal space, and namely in the DoD, especially with the combatant commands, it's not just military branches where there could be an overlap in identity data. Now you're talking about mission partners. Now if I'm Paul Kim on the US side, how do I ensure that it's not Paul Kim on an ally side with a Korean counterpart, for example, doing a joint war game exercise in the Indo-Pacific? And part of that is contextually aggregating that data, creating that master profile of that user. So now you have a rich set of attributes that ensure that user is who they say they are, and now you can make policy-based decisions based off the data to enable the likes of access management in the cloud with Okta and identity as a service to use the likes of a ServiceNow or a Salesforce, or onboard, offboard from a security perspective with identity governance or privilege access. And lastly, it's reforming the DoD for better performance. So by automating some of these legacy processes, you have a holistic suite of solutions that not only accelerate time to delivery, but aggressively lower costs, and that's what we're seeing from our customers.
Frank, speed is very important in doing all of this. Advanced identity analytics and automation, I'm sure, are critical components in ensuring that you're able to maintain the speed that's necessary. So could you elaborate a little bit on why?
Sure. What you're going to see a lot as the market grows, its adoption of artificial intelligence and machine learning, you're going to see capabilities start to develop into the platforms. And the reason being is as we grow all these authoritative sources, build all these data lakes, the amount of data, the amount of entitlements and applications that can be assigned to someone, it becomes very vast. So by leveraging these technologies, we can start looking at outliers a lot easier. We can start looking and doing predictive analytics at what modeling for access should look like. Get to an autonomous state where we're granting and removing and dissolving access automatically based on historical data that we can trend over large amounts of data.
I'm going to see if I can get a final 30 seconds from each one of you about where we're going and what needs to be first on the list, and that way we can kind of get to some parting thoughts, takeaways from you, starting with you, Habib.
So where we're going and where I'd like to see us going, I think where we're going is we are moving towards a model where identity is becoming the center. And we need to get there. Ideally, I think we'd all like to see us get there faster, because you do see that threat, and there is a gap from where the threat actors are and where we are in some places. From an Okta perspective, and for me personally, that access is going to be that key component, especially around zero trust, right? And not just being able to score that transaction, apply that context, but then also be able to work with partners and take all the information that I get as the front door and feed that to those corresponding systems and other security applications to make those informed decisions, automate that response and that reaction so that you do end up with a more fluid response.
Kevin, 30 seconds from you.
Yeah. So as I've said earlier, I think where we're going is around the automation world, where we have robots, literally robotic process automation tools that will start to replace humans in their day-to-day tasks, right? Standard repeatable tasks. Those robots will still have credentials. And what we'll look to do is to be able to provide secrets and non-human entities with credential access.
Okay.
And that's really the key. Is I think human identity is extremely important, but we also need to look beyond just humans and understand that automation is coming.
Okay, 30 seconds from you, Bill.
I think it all depends on the data, right? So from a radiological perspective, it's having that federated, multi-domain federated attribute exchange layer as a foundation. Because emerging requirements will arise and new requirements will come about. However, the target is the same. You need to be able to move at the speed and need of the mission, and by having that aggregation point, you can do that.
Okay, last word.
Absolutely, I agree with all these guys. As agencies start moving forward or continuing this journey, I think the one thing I'd like to see in moving forward is really the program governance to make it easy. That's what's going to make it easy on the agencies, is really having that interaction amongst themselves and other stakeholders, and then internally and externally, right? I think that's where the most focus needs to be met.
Brilliant. Thank you. Big pleasure of mine to be able to sit with you guys today. That's all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank all of our guests. I'm your moderator, JJ Green, and you're listening to Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com, search Cyber Leaders.